The Anatolian sun blazes down, turning the horizon into a shimmering wall of heat. Across it stretches a living sea, 80,000 Arab warriors, their banners snapping, their spears glittering like a forest of steel. Hooves pound against the dry earth, dust rising in choking clouds, the sound of an empire's momentum pressing forward. Before them stand 7,000 Byzantines, no larger than a small town, their line narrow and fragile against the endless tide. Their shields glint, their breath comes heavy, their fate seemingly already written. Few against many, survival against annihilation. What possible chance did they have? This battle would not be remembered for numbers, but for something far more elusive. A strategy forged in desperation, sharpened by survival. A clash that makes sense only when you understand the world that created it. By the early 8th century, Byzantium was an empire in name more than reality. Once it had ruled the Mediterranean, its cities jeweled and its armies unmatched. Now, much of that world was gone. Syria had fallen, Egypt had been stripped away, North Africa lost to a tide of conquest that seemed to know no end. Provinces that once poured grain and gold into Constantinople now sent nothing but silence. The Arab armies of the Umayyad Caliphate had surged like wildfire across the old Roman domains, carried by faith, steel, and a momentum that crushed resistance. In less than a century, they had swept from the deserts of Arabia to the shores of the Atlantic, and every campaign brought them closer to the Bosporus itself. To the Byzantines, they seemed unstoppable, less an army than an inevitability. On the empire's eastern frontier, survival was measured one campaign at a time. Villages along the Anatolian border lived with the constant shadow of raids, their harvests burned, their people taken. Each spring, as snow melted from the mountain passes, soldiers and civilians alike waited for the banners of Islam to appear over the ridges. The empire's emperors spoke of defense, but defense was fragile, and every year the line seemed to shrink. By 740 AD, the pressure had become unbearable. The Arabs launched one of their greatest offensives into Asia Minor, a campaign meant not simply to plunder but to break Byzantium's spine. The armies converged at a place called Acronon, a quiet corner of Anatolia about to become the fulcrum of two civilizations. To the outside observer, the outcome seemed preordained. An empire weakened, fractured, struggling to hold its breath, faced a juggernaut fueled by conquest and belief. Acronon was expected to be another page in a long record of defeat, yet what happened there would defy every expectation. To grasp the miracle of victory, we first need to understand why defeat seemed inevitable. To understand the scale of the threat, one must picture the Arab army of the 8th century not as a single host but as a living organism, vast and tireless. Its strength lay in numbers, yes, but also in the rhythm of its campaigns. Tens of thousands of soldiers could be summoned from the heartlands of Syria and Mesopotamia, mounted on swift horses and camels, supplied by networks that stretched across deserts and mountains alike. What had once been scattered tribal warriors had become a disciplined force, hardened by a century of victories. Their cavalry was the heart of their power. Swift riders, clothed in mail and armed with lances, could strike with blinding speed, enveloping slower foes. Foot soldiers pressed forward behind them, steady and relentless, while commanders, appointed by the Caliph, directed the field with the confidence of men accustomed to triumph. From the banks of the Nile to the hills of Armenia, the pattern was the same. The Arabs advanced, and their enemies fell back. There was more than steel at work. Each soldier carried the conviction of a faith that promised both worldly glory and eternal reward. This spiritual fire gave them endurance that outlasted the fatigue of campaigns and lent them a sense of inevitability. To resist them seemed not only dangerous but futile. Their banners carried the weight of destiny, and when they appeared on the horizon, fear often conquered before the swords were drawn. The Byzantines knew this all too well. For decades, they had fought retreating battles, trading cities and provinces for survival. The Arab reputation for invincibility grew with every campaign, and with it came a form of psychological warfare that no proclamation from Constantinople could counter. To face the Caliph's army was to face the crushing certainty of defeat. And yet inevitability has cracks. The Byzantines had learned to watch, to adapt, to endure. They studied the war machine that threatened them, looking not only at its strength but at the vulnerabilities hidden beneath its speed and scale. What they saw would allow them, in one desperate battle, to turn certainty into chaos. If the Arab war machine embodied overwhelming force, the Byzantine response embodied survival. By the time of Emperor Leo III and his son Constantine V, Byzantium had been living under siege for generations. Survival required more than courage. It demanded adaptation. The empire could not outnumber its enemies, so it learned to outthink them. At the heart of this survival was doctrine. The Byzantines perfected a military system that prized flexibility over brute strength. Their armies were not vast, but they were disciplined, divided into mobile cavalry units that could wheel, strike, and retreat with precision. Infantry provided the shield wall, but the cavalry carried the decisive edge, trained to move as one body rather than as scattered horsemen. Intelligence networks fed commanders vital information long before battle lines formed. Scouts tracked enemy columns, while local guides mapped terrain down to the last ridge and stream. Byzantium turned geography into a weapon, forcing invaders into bottlenecks, luring them into valleys, exhausting them on barren ground. Where the Arabs brought numbers, the Byzantines brought knowledge. Leadership was equally crucial. Leo III had risen from obscurity through his grasp of strategy, a man forged by decades of fighting on the empire's fragile eastern border. Constantine V, his son, inherited not just command but the relentless pragmatism of a dynasty that knew it governed on borrowed time. Together, they instilled discipline, drilling their soldiers not to break when the enemy seemed unstoppable. To the common soldier, this discipline was a lifeline, the difference between cohesion and collapse. Religion, too, played its role. Soldiers carried crosses, invoked the Virgin Mary, and believed their endurance had divine sanction. Against an opponent fueled by faith, the Byzantines answered with their own, weaving morale into the fabric of strategy. In their eyes, every battle was a trial not only of skill but of belief. The contrast could not be starker. Arab armies swept forward with momentum, overwhelming with speed and scale. Byzantine armies stood smaller, tighter, sharper, turning every advantage of terrain and discipline into leverage. Where the Arabs sought to roll forward like a tide, the Byzantines sought to become the rock that redirected the wave. But even doctrine and planning mean little without the right battlefield. At Acronon, the Byzantines would find one. The land around Acronon was deceptive. To the untrained eye, it was a stretch of rolling Anatolian hills broken by dry plains and rocky outcrops. But to soldiers, every rise, every slope, every narrow corridor between ridges could decide the fate of an army. Here, the Byzantines saw not emptiness, but opportunity. The Arab host approached in its vastness, 80,000 men spreading like a tide across the plain. Dust boiled upward in thick clouds as cavalry hooves and marching feet beat the earth into thunder. To the Byzantines, it must have felt like watching the horizon itself advance, banners shimmering, armour flashing beneath the unforgiving Sunday. Against this, their own 7,000 seemed swallowed by scale, a speck of defiance before an ocean. Yet placement mattered. The Byzantine commanders did not stretch their line thin to match the Arab breadth. Instead, they chose their ground carefully, anchoring their flanks against rises and uneven slopes that funneled the enemy forward. The hills forced the larger army to break its cohesion, scattering momentum into fragments. Where the Arabs saw open country, the Byzantines saw natural traps. Every soldier in the smaller force understood what was at stake. They were not defending a single patch of ground, but the survival of their empire. The silence before the clash was suffocating, broken only by the shifting of shields, the restless snorts of horses, and the distant roar of the Arab advance drawing closer. Two forces now faced one another, so unequal it seemed absurd. One a tidal wave, immense and rolling forward with the certainty of conquest. The other a narrow rock, immovable only if it held its ground. Both could not endure. The moment of collision was coming, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The signal was given, and the Arab host surged forward. From a distance it was thunder. Up close, it was a storm of dust, steel, and hooves. 80,000 men roared down upon a line that should have broken at the first touch. Spears lowered, lances glittered, and the earth trembled as if under the weight of the sea itself. The Byzantines stood fast. Shields locked, spears braced, their cavalry poised in tight formations behind the front. The first wave struck, a hammer blow that shook the line. Iron rang on iron. Horses screamed, men shouted, prayers drowned by the crash of impact. Yet the Byzantine line did not shatter. It bent, absorbed the weight, then pushed back. Suddenly, from the wings, Byzantine cavalry wheeled into motion. Precise, disciplined, they struck at overextended Arab units, slicing into flanks that had stretched too far. What seemed a seamless wave fractured into ripples, momentum faltering as dust clouds hid confusion. The Arabs pressed harder, convinced that sheer numbers would decide the field. But every push found resistance, every surge met with a counterstroke. Ambushes snapped open. Hidden detachments of Byzantines charged from cover, striking with brutal timing. Horses collided, men were thrown, formations tangled in their own momentum. The battlefield dissolved into chaos, dust so thick that soldiers could scarcely see the banners meant to guide them. What had begun as certainty turned into disorder. Then came the shock. Amid the press of fighting, Arab commanders fell. Leaders who held the cohesion of tens of thousands were cut down, their loss spreading panic like a spark in dry grass. Orders faltered. Shouts contradicted. The great war machine, built on momentum, suddenly stumbled. For the Byzantines, this was the moment. Cavalry struck again and again, breaking scattered units into fleeing remnants. The Arab host, once a storm, fractured into fragments. The sound of victory was not a cheer, but the desperate retreat of an army that had believed itself invincible. Against every prediction, the tide had turned. Acronon, meant to be another step toward Byzantium's destruction, became a triumph carved out of impossibility. But victory was not the end. What would it mean for two empires locked in struggle, one grasping for survival, the other for dominance? When the dust settled over Acronon, the field bore witness to something Byzantium had not known in a generation. Triumph. Against impossible odds, the empire's battered armies had stood, and the caliph's proud host had broken. For the Byzantines, it was more than a battlefield victory. It was proof that survival was not only possible but within their grasp. Soldiers who had braced for annihilation instead carried home stories of Arab defeat, stories that spread like fire through villages and cities long accustomed to mourning. In Constantinople, the news was received as a deliverance. For Leo III and Constantine V, the victory solidified legitimacy, giving their reigns a mantle of divine favour. An empire too often on the defensive could finally breathe, if only for a moment. Acronon was no conquest, no reclaiming of lost provinces, but its psychological weight was immense. It restored confidence in the Byzantine system of war, in the ability of a smaller, disciplined force to resist the tide of conquest. For the Arabs, the defeat was sobering. It did not break the Caliphate's power, nor halt its campaigns entirely, but it did mark the end of inevitability. The myth of unstoppable advance had been pierced. Strategists in Damascus could no longer assume that every march into Anatolia would end in plunder and victory. They now knew the Byzantines could not be erased with a single blow. The frontier stabilized. The Caliphate's attention shifted elsewhere. Its armies turned to other theatres, and Byzantium gained something it had not possessed in decades: time. Centuries of survival were purchased on that single field. Time that would allow Constantinople to fortify, reorganize, and eventually rise again to face new threats. Yet Acronon was not merely about reprieve. It was a pivot point, one of those moments when the course of history trembles. Had the Arabs triumphed, Byzantium's eastern heartland might have been gutted, its empire reduced to little more than the walls of its capital. Instead, the empire endured, and endurance meant influence far beyond its borders. But this battle was not just about the year 740. Its lessons carried further, echoing into every age where the few faced the many. The paradox of Acronon lingers across the centuries. How could 7,000 men stand against 80,000 and live to tell the tale? The numbers alone suggest impossibility, yet history is rarely written by numbers alone. At Acronon, leadership, adaptability, and terrain outweighed sheer size. The Byzantines proved that wars are not always decided by the biggest army, but by the smartest. Their victory reminds us that survival often belongs to those who learn, adjust, and seize the hidden advantages that others overlook. The Arabs carried momentum, belief, and overwhelming strength, but the Byzantines carried patience, discipline, and strategy. In the clash of empires, it was not the tide but the rock that endured. This lesson extends beyond antiquity. Time and again, history shows that human intelligence, creativity, and resolve can overturn what seems inevitable. From outnumbered armies to underdog nations, the story repeats. The few can defy the many if they understand the field on which they fight. Acronon is not remembered for conquest or glory. It is remembered because it embodies survival against the odds. The 7,000 who stood there should have been forgotten, swallowed by the dust of defeat. Instead, they carved their defiance into history, a reminder that no force, however vast, is truly unstoppable. Their real weapon was not the sword, but strategy.